Hello, this is the next lecture in your English 232 class about, this is a preparation for you to understand a number of things that happen in American literature that without this background, maybe it would be difficult to understand certain things in the 19th century. This is a lecture I'm calling Transcendentalism, Abolitionism, and their influence on American literature. And I would tell you that we might also add, and their influence on us even today in the 21st century. My last lecture to you involved a discussion in some depth about Jefferson's idea of nature's God, which is not a fundamental contradiction of the God of the Bible, but certainly makes an emphasis on something entirely different, and that is possible, at least in theory, to believe in nature's God and not believe in the God of the Bible. Many people who would talk to you about the evidence of God in nature would certainly say they were also followers of a scriptural God. But nature's God, Jefferson's idea. Let's talk about this for a minute again. His radical idea, which he borrows from other thinkers, and I'll get to that in a second, influences at least two movements in the century after his death. One is called Transcendentalism, and here you see a man who is having a sublime moment, standing rather precariously on a rock overlooking a grand vista. We only see his back, but surely he looks enraptured. And abolitionism, which is not a philosophical movement the way that Transcendentalism is, but is, for all intents and purposes, strictly a political movement of the 19th century, one that encompasses a variety of points of view, but has an objective goal of ending slavery once and for all, as immediately as possible and without exception. While Jefferson adopted the idea of nature and nature's God as a justification for American liberty, the ideas that he expresses so well in the Declaration of Independence are not, strictly speaking, developed entirely on his own. He has been informed by other things that he has read and seen. Most importantly, according to most scholars, would be his intellectual interest in a group of Enlightenment thinkers from France known as les philosophes, who imagine a country where there is something which Jefferson calls a meritocracy, meaning a person advances not as he would in an aristocracy by virtue of his birth, but by the merits of what he can do or what he can persuade other people to do with him. And les philosophes have quite a lot to say. Here what we see is a portrait of an important philosophe, not the only one who influenced our revolution, but Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Rousseau rejected the ideas of kings as unnatural. They are unnatural to him because if you think about it, you could have a father or a mother who is an important figure in your life, but there is no natural idea of a king. And he believed that people should be free, but he actually phrases it in such a way that it suggests that he thinks men should be free, and he's not quite sure, in all honesty, that women are capable of intellectual thought, and admittedly the women he would have met during his lifetime had not had access to education the way that men had, which was a great injustice done to women up until very recently in the world. What he writes famously is, "Man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains." That was his observation of the world. And he contrasts the idea then of a natural state that inheres from God's creation, and the chained up person who is either being deported as an indentured servant to the New World, is a slave, or is for some other reason in bondage, often without having done any crime. And I want to make this clear. Rousseau never met a Native American person in his whole life, but he had some awfully high ideas about them. He called them, quite racistly in fact, noble savages. And he meant to compliment them. In all sincerity, he did. Because what he wanted to say was, if you contrast the people who are in the Native American nations, the tribes of Native American Indians, with the courtiers at Versailles. The courtiers at the Versailles are nipped and tucked and put into corsets, powdered all over. Men and women wore makeup. They wore ridiculous shoes they couldn't run in. In order to behave like a courtier, you had to act in such a radically unnatural manner. Whereas his impression, based on reports he had read from other people who had gone to the New World, were that instead of trying to say flowery things in some kind of rhyming poetry, or what were in fact the sick burns of the court of Versailles, known as simply ridicule, he imagined a plain-spoken and direct and without pretense set of conversations that Native Americans would have. Now, he had never himself had a conversation with anyone from any of the Native American Indian nations, so he was basing this entirely on stereotype. But what he did know for certain was how fake the people were at Versailles, and he thought that that was wrong, and that to be a noble savage would be far preferable than to be a noble courtier. That was his thinking. He also believed that education should change radically. There was a didactic model in the European way of educating, where an expert stood at the front of the room and told you what to think. A didactic education, if any of you have gone through catechism, and anyone who is raised Catholic may indeed have gone through catechism, that's the didactic model. The priest is an expert. You probably have a book of questions, and under each question is a single answer to that question. There can be no other answer. Why? The expert says so. There is one question that, in fact, the person at the front of the room has set, and the single right answer is right there in front of you. Keep moving. Once you've memorized it, your job is to memorize what somebody else told you. Don't ask too many tough questions that might be more abstract or far-ranging than this set of questions, at least not during catechism. That's a didactic model of instruction. Now, I don't want to reduce the entire Catholic educational system to that. The Jesuits very famously throw that out the window when they do their own kinds of queries into their faith. But that is the manner in which most human beings in Europe who had an education, and those human beings would mostly be men, received an education. And so he wants people to reason out problems for themselves based on the evidence that they find. He doesn't just want them to have an uninvestigated idea. That would be a prejudice. But he wants them to explore, and he wants it to be much freer. He wrote a whole book about that called Emile, if you're ever interested. Again, he had a picture for a young boy's education. Girls, he imagined, were far less capable of doing what he imagined boys could do. And just as he had never met and a Native American, he had never met a woman who had been allowed to go to college either. So both of his ideas on both these groups were fundamentally flawed. But he got some ideas, Jefferson, not just from guys like Rousseau and the French philosophes. He got some of his ideas from two Christian denominations that were popular in the 13 colonies, entirely independent of him. And I wanted to talk to you about both of them. To my knowledge, these are not highly populated denominations in Louisiana, although they do still exist. Pardon me while I take a sip of Diet Coke. The Quakers and the Congregationalists. Let me tell you about the Quakers. They believe that there should be no bishop, nor even a pastor, and that Christians as a group should listen to God for guidance, both through the Bible and through what they call the inner light of God. Sometimes they also use the term the Spirit guide. And when I say there's no pastor, I mean it. I one time knew a couple who were getting married in the Quaker denomination, and it was quite something to see. The marriage contract, and it's been this way since the 1600s, went like this. They called a meeting. They don't even call it a church service. A meeting for the purpose of marriage. And somebody who has just been given the job of a facilitator says, these two people have decided that they are going to get married. And anyone who wishes to speak, who is congregated that day at the meeting house, may say something. And there are long periods of silence in any Quaker meeting. And so we sat there for about an hour, and a couple of people sang songs. It was quite lovely. Many people wished the couple well. And it felt as bonding and serious as any wedding I've ever been to, but it was far less structured. And at the end of the meeting, everyone shook hands and kissed the bride and groom. And we all signed the marriage contract as the officiants. We were the people collectively who had married them. And not only is this legal, it is traditional in the Quaker religion, or the Quaker denomination of Christianity, I should say. It's so different than getting married in a Catholic church. If any of you have ever attended a Catholic wedding, you know what I'm talking about. They believe that preaching is or can be a distraction from meditating on the presence of God. A Quaker meeting on Sunday doesn't usually have any kind of direction. People just show up and sit. And when people feel moved to speak, they may do so. They are cautioned not to speak for longer than God would have them speak, which unless you've got a literally mentally ill person, is usually brief, a couple of sentences, and a large part of the service is spent in silence. It's actually quite moving. I was very surprised. I'm not someone who is a Quaker, but I really find it very moving. This is the tradition, and this again was a very popular denomination in Jefferson's day, though he was not a Quaker. And they believe in radical pacifism, that God would never want anybody to kill anybody else under any circumstances. This is so much the tradition of the Quakers that a person who has a demonstrated pacifist Quaker faith is not required to go to war in times of draft in the United States. It's that old of a tradition and that real of a tradition. Although they may end up being drafted for public service like paving roads or things like this, that if everyone has to go fight in the war, but the Quakers, they'll have some kind of job. Sometimes they also operate in a medical capacity, helping get people off the battlefield who've been shot. But these are the tenets of Quaker thinking, and they are significant in the thinking that informed, to some degree, Jefferson's thinking. The Congregationalists were far more popular than they are today, a very big denomination in the 13 colonies. And each Congregationalist congregation is allowed to interpret the Bible for itself. But something that really influences, according to almost every historian, the structure of how we choose leaders in the government, or even how we make decisions in America, they believed that all important church decisions should be made by the group of people who congregate in the congregation, or church members, not the people who are ostensibly leaders. They don't have bishops. And years before any Americans voted in a political election, members of the Congregationalist churches of America voted. So these are things that are profoundly influential in the thinking of Jefferson, which in turn is profoundly influential in the thinking of some of the other people I'm going to talk to you about in this lecture. Jefferson, in what he wrote as the statement of what America was, in leaving Great Britain, gave those who came after him permission to rethink everything. Here are some things that he basically opens the door to. If a government doesn't work, invent a new government. We did that. If a tradition held by one's ancestors turns out to make no sense, rethink things based on what one sees in nature, the natural world, and also in human nature. If an old philosophy no longer makes sense, invent a new philosophy. We're very good at that in this country. Never, ever be afraid to reinvent things if the old things simply no longer work. I know that this seems like common sense to the people of the United States, but in other parts of the world, this is the craziest of crazy talk. I tell you this because I think it will help you understand what comes next in this class. And I want to say this is perhaps the greatest American freedom distinct to us. People have the right to reinvent themselves, not based on who their people were, but on what they can do and what they can think. Americans feel like that's their right. There are plenty of parts in the world where people don't feel like that's something that is their right. And so I say thank you, Thomas Jefferson, that informed him. And so in the atmosphere of such freedom, a group of radical thinkers emerged in New England in the 1840s. That's about 75 years after the Declaration of Independence. The Transcendentalists, or 65 years, I beg your pardon. And the Transcendentalists included people who were famous writers. Henry David Thoreau, who was on your reading list. Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was on your reading list. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who wrote the Scarlet Letter. Young Goodman Brown, who I almost put on your reading list. And if you've ever read Little Women, Louisa May Alcott's family were part of the Transcendentalist group. And later on, Walt Whitman would join their way of thinking, though not formally be part of a group of the philosophical school of Transcendentalism. So here were some of the ideas that these Transcendentalists had, shocking as they were. First, nature is a source of truth. I think that today we imagine that nature may be something that we need to pay attention to. In an era of climate change, most of us think we really ought to be paying attention to the ice caps. We also believe that herbs might be useful to people who have diseases. There are a number of things that would be helpful to us. Transcendentalists go into nature in order to find themselves. Thoreau does this. They simplify their lives and try to live outside of human expectations sometimes as a meditative exercise. The human body is a source of truth. This hardly seems to be much of a new idea to anyone in the 21st century in the United States. We all believe, for instance, we ought to make sure that our bodies are healthy. We don't just work, we work out. Um, we dress in a manner that displays our body more than people displayed it in the early 1800s. We try to take care of our bodies. And we assume that while they're not the source of our intellectual truth, they're important. This was considered crazy talk to people in the time of the Transcendental school of thought. Generally speaking, people were influenced by something called Cartesian dualism, which said, if I'm a really pious person, I'm not going to think about my body. I'm going to think about God only, and things of the body are the way of the flesh. It's bad. The flesh is bad. I should lean on the things of the spirit only. Um, and just so you understand, the Transcendentalists were considered insane because they took baths daily if they could, and they would talk about stuff like sex or just, at this time, if you were a woman and you had, let's say, twisted your ankle and you had to call for the doctor to see if it was broken. Well, today, you would hop up on a doctor's examination table and say, I think I twisted my ankle. My leg hurts. All of those words would be shocking if you were a lady back in 1840. You would say, my lower limbs have a problem, doctor. Would you please examine me? That's as frank as you could get. You didn't mention legs or ankles. That's too shocking. So the human body as a source of truth was, in fact, a radical way of expressing oneself. And people ought to be self-reliant in their thinking. You ought to be an independent thinker. And just because somebody tells you it's so based on tradition, you should double check. You should discover truth through observation of evidence rather than simply relying on old ideas from long dead experts without examining things for themselves. You would want to. It's not that there's no wisdom in dead experts, but you'd want to double check to make sure they got it right. People do not benefit, according to Transcendentalism, from didactic guidance of religious organizations and their rituals in pursuing a closer relationship with God, which requires an openness of heart and a receptivity of spirit. In other words, sitting in church, standing up, sitting down, crossing yourself, kneeling, or even listening to somebody's possibly very intelligent sermon are not going to help you get closer to God. Most Protestant Christians would talk about a personal relationship with God that people need to have. The Transcendentalists take it one step further. They don't even think you need any sermons because they just get in the way of your conversation with God. And most Transcendentalists did believe in God, and they would do this to the point where they would dedicate their children to God. They would declare their marriages and bury their dead, all without any formal Christian sacrament, a bit like the Quaker wedding I described. There's no church leader. There's just, Lord, this baby's going to live for you. Or we bury our friend Fred today. We remember him. God have mercy on his soul. But it's just the buddies of Fred talking. No preacher, no pastor, no priest around. And then this was exceedingly radical. Everyone is connected to each other regardless of gender or race. That was huge and very new. They called this connection either the soul or the oversoul. You'll want to take note of that. Notice that capital S is used for that soul. You could have an individual soul, but the capital S soul is the collective nature of humanity. I beg your pardon, and our connection to one another. Emerson founded Transcendentalism, and he urged others to rethink religion. He says a few things about that. Don't listen to somebody else. The faith that stands on authority is not faith, by which he means the experts can't tell you to believe in God and have that be faith. That's just the expert talking to you. He believes in God, but he's probably not going to be chosen as Sunday school teacher. He's too radical even today. Um, he says any human ritual is unlikely to lead someone to God. He says faith makes us and not we it. And faith makes its own forms, meaning its own way of doing things. If you want to worship God, you shouldn't do some kind of collective worship unless you all feel moved in the same way, not just because Sunday 10 o'clock you have this meeting with them. That's Emerson's idea. It sure isn't most denomination of Christianity's idea. And then there's Thoreau, who has this idea of the personal conscious versus the collective conscious as a way to deal with what could be considered an unjust or immoral law of the United States government. You're going to read what he has to say about that. He basically says that if there is a law that would hurt someone else, and maybe it's not going to hurt you, but if you obey it, you would help the government hurt somebody else, you shouldn't obey that law, but then you have to take the penalty that the government gives you for not obeying that law. That's the idea of civil disobedience. You don't just commit a crime and run off. You say, I break the law because it's wrong. Take me away to prison if you must. And he believes that no person has a moral obligation to obey an inherently unjust law, as nature and his moral conscience would tell him to disobey. But he doesn't believe in violent rebellion against unjust laws. His idea of civil disobedience, just like Dr. King's was, is not violent. You shouldn't take up arms against somebody because killing would be immoral, even if you're killing because of the unjust law. But that poor cop, he's just trying to uphold the law. That's his job. Don't get into a fight with him about it. That's the wrong approach. That's Thoreau's idea. And about this same time, as the rise of transcendentalism, a strictly political movement begins, not entirely coincidentally given these ideas floating around in the air, of abolitionism. And here you see a drawing that would have been circulated in the form of a pamphlet to people to convince them to be against slavery. And I think that this is very moving. We see that we are to consider, if we receive this pamphlet, the people in chains as our brethren, and we should therefore come to their aid. I've given you the frontispiece of the sheet music for Dixie. You know that song. Oh, I wish I were in the land of cotton, old times there are not forgotten. You've heard that song. It's a song that was the national anthem of the Confederacy, and it was part of a form of propaganda being used to tell white people in general that slavery was moral. Let me explain how that could be. Dixie, I'm sorry to tell you, was not written in the South for the Civil War. It was written where I come from, New York City, and it was written for a show called a minstrel show, where white people would put blackface on, because that's not racist. No, they would do it in a fully racist paradigm. And they would sing this song, and it's supposed to be these people who ran away from slavery, and now they're super sorry they're free. They want to go back. They wish they were in the land of cotton, old times there are not forgotten. And this was a popular song. I mean, it's kind of catchy, but it also painted a picture of slavery making slaves happy. They were told, white people, that African Americans were simply too stupid to run their own lives. I want you to understand, I vehemently disagree with that. I cannot say how deeply I disagree with that. Of course, African Americans are just as smart as anybody else, but this idea was the excuse for why they should be enslaved. White people were generally told that black men were oversexed and dangerous to white women in particular, without brutal discipline overseen by white men holding them back, which is also nonsense and very offensive. And then they were told that African Americans were simply happier in slavery, where someone, quote unquote, could look after them, as if getting whipped within an inch of your life was getting looked after. It's so offensive on so many levels, but this was really the propaganda of the plantation culture. And the song Dixie is an example of this propaganda. I wanted to show you this so that we could really talk about how important a man Frederick Douglass is, and how important the abolitionist movement was, and how it could be seen as so radical. They also had the anti-propaganda leaflets that they would hand out in the abolitionist movement, because not all white people believe these lies. They handed out things like this. It said, "I would never have drawn my sword in the cause of America if I could have conceived that thereby I was founding the land of slavery." Yeah, that would have been my sentiment. In 1833, the American Anti-Slavery Society was founded by William Lord Garrison. He was white, and started to campaign against slavery, demanding an immediate, total, and unconditional end to slavery. And he was not going to pull any punches rhetorically about it. Many white people joined the movement, including a great many Quakers who already believed that slavery was an offense to God. Unsurprisingly, many African Americans who were not enslaved joined as well. Of course they did. But there was one abolitionist in particular who was especially important to the movement. If you haven't heard of Frederick Douglass, you're going to love the speech he wrote. He taught himself to read and write as a slave, escaped north to freedom, and started the abolitionist paper, the North Star, in northern New York State. He was a smart and brave man, and so Douglass's every word was proof that the pro-slavery propaganda about dumb slaves was based on a pack of lies. Douglass spoke to thousands of audiences in every state in America where he might not be captured and sent back as a runaway slave. And he wasn't just morally right about the cruelty of slavery, which he described. He was eloquent. He made people cry. He was brilliant. He was passionate. It was impossible not to be persuaded that this man was telling you the truth. And how could slavery be for the good of some group of stupid black people if a former slave stood before the crowd, clearly articulate and persuasive, hence not stupid, and told them clearly that slavery was brutal and unjust, and he would know he had been its victim. And he wasn't just a good speechwriter. His oratory is among the best ever given by any speaker anywhere. When I teach people how to write speeches, I teach Frederick Douglass speeches. I teach other people's too. If this were a longer class, I would include more great American speeches for your ability to see how wonderful so many of them are. But among the best are Frederick Douglass's. In arguing for the end of slavery, he was effectively demanding, by who he clearly was, that black people were every bit as capable of genius as white people were. Because indeed, it was clear after spending an hour listening to him to think anything other than that he was a brilliant man with great gifts. And if that were so, surely many slaves were at least as intelligent as he was. And if that were so, slavery had to be something that America had every reason to rethink and to repent of. This lecture is over. You will want to keep it in mind, though, as you read Walt Whitman. He is more than a little informed by the things I've mentioned in this lecture.